Once upon a time, in the far western portion of Sherwood Forest, known as America, there was a king. The king told all the people of the land that if they would just trust him, he would see to it that everyone in the kingdom was exactly the same. He would bring equality to the kingdom. He gained the admiration of the peasants by telling them that those who lived in larger huts, that they would be punished, and those who lived in castles would finally be made to pay their fair share. No one noticed that the king himself lived in a castle. But those were made to pay and cut down to size. The peasants rejoiced and loved the king. First, the king decreed that too many peasants had died during the Black Plague because they didn't have enough easy access to the village physician. The leech insurance was not so good. So the king placed an extra tax on all those in larger huts and castles to ensure that more of the leeches would become available to suck the blood out of all of the peasants when they became ill. So from now on, he assured the people of the forest, as well as those in neighboring hamlets and villages, that if they liked their leeches, they could keep their leeches. Sadly, the king's promise had to be broken. Although the village crier simply informed the peasants and the serfs that many of their leeches were inferior leeches, and that's why they couldn't keep them. They'd be replaced with kingdom-approved leeches. Next, the king sent out, strangely, Sheriff Biden of IRSingham to further collect taxes from the evil, wealthy elite. It seemed that the force teemed with people who were doing far too well, and the king was only taking only 50% of everything that they owned so far. It wasn't nearly enough. How could they possibly keep 50% of what they worked for? The king despised those people, those who worked hard and applied themselves, those who actually became not just self-sufficient and reliant, but those who were able to lend a helping hand to others and to contribute some sort of their earnings to build hospitals or libraries for those who could read, including peasants who would be taught to read at those libraries in the nearby hamlets and villages. Oh, the king hated the fact that those people didn't need to rely on him. For he believed, being king, he was all-important, omnipotent, and that all aid and all benefits and all success needed to come through him, his way. Then, when those successful merchants would die, until now, they'd been allowed to pass on what they had to their children. But because the king had already taxed all of their earnings while they were living, all of that which was left to their children had been considered for their children to inherit. This was unacceptable to the king. Yes, the king also knew that if he took any of their estate inheritance, it would be of little or no benefit to the kingdom as a whole, for it took resources from the people. But the king didn't care. So into the forest he sent the sheriff and his thugs to seize the property and coin. Knights and their squires came riding into the forest, the hamlets and the villages, ransacking and looting every large hut and castle until there wasn't a single coin to be had among the wealthy that the king despised. And now, with no coins, no property, the wealthy, too, were peasants. Peasants, too, without their leeches. Tragically, there was no Robin Hood here. In the far western reaches of Sherwood Forest, known as America, Robin Hood was sadly gone. No one to stop the king and the sheriff, as there was on the other side of the big pond. That Robin Hood was able to stop the looting by King John and return his money to the rightful owners. Such was not the case in this region of the forest. Thus, the king and the sheriff lived handsomely on the bounty they confiscated. They built larger and larger palaces for themselves and for their workers. And they partied every Monday through Wednesday with Sir J.Z. of the Hampton, son of Adnis, and feasted on pheasant and wild boar, gosling cream-covered fruit, and dozens of saffron-covered boiled eggs each and every meal. Then the king and the sheriff hired more knights to protect them, and allowed those knights to bed down with the concubines and wenches to help them pass the time when they traveled to far-off distant lands like Colombia. The king built larger and more cricket courses and played over 200 times, while the peasants continued to think about the leeches that they were promised they could keep, but had lost. The king's parties never ceased, even as the peasants starved. Meanwhile, with no more wealthy merchants to pay the peasants, there were no longer any jobs. No one had any money at all. No one had anything any longer to pay for the physicians, or the physicians' leeches, when the plague came back. Everyone in the kingdom died. But the good news is the king was true to his word. They were all equal now, equally dead. The king had fulfilled his promise of equality to the peasants. The end.
Not exactly a happy tale.
I was
Well,
wait
a minute. They're not usually happy.
No, that's true.
Not
Well,
usually.
The Grimm's fairy tales are almost never happy.
Yeah, because
right?
they're meant to teach you a lesson.
And that was not Disneyfied.
No, it was not. I still feel bad for the leeches that have been lost. Let's go to Jeff. See, and this is not about us by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
Because, believe me, this government will give us leeches. In fact, this government is filled with leeches.